Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. Today we are discussing one of the most infamous haunted houses in all of America, the Myrtles Plantation, also known as the Myrtles. This is an old school Louisiana plantation that is completely surrounded by mystery. It's said to have 10 to 12 ghostly inhabitants. It is said to have been built on ancient Indian burial grounds. It's said that there were a slew of murders which took place at this plantation. So it obviously has a very colorful history. And since we're down in Louisiana, the infamous home of magic, mystery, voodoo, vampires, you name it, they got it. I just felt that it was appropriate to crack open an original Voodoo Ranger Imperial IPA from New Belgium Brewing. This stuff is great, and it's the perfect amount of alcohol to get me into the mindset. So without further ado, this is the Myrtles Plantation, and as always, let's start at the beginning. So the true beginning of all this takes place in Washington County, Pennsylvania, shortly after the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War. Now, this was kind of a chaotic time in American history. We were still a few years away from being under our current constitution. We were under what was called the Articles of Confederation, and the federal government at the time wasn't really all that powerful, not like it is today. A lot of authority was kind of just left up to the states, and each state has its own kind of cultural identity, and many of the citizens of these states just kind of did their own thing. They didn't pay too much mind to this loose confederation that made up our original federal government. So one of the citizens of these new United States was a man named David Bradford. He was born in 1762, and he was a successful lawyer and deputy attorney general for Washington County, Pennsylvania. And a deputy attorney general on the county level, we would call that a district attorney today or a county prosecutor. So let's say you commit a crime, you go to court, the county prosecutor is going to be the lawyer on the opposing side trying to convince the judge that, yeah, you committed the crime, you need to go to jail. And he was obviously a very successful district attorney. He builds this mansion in Washington County, Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful house. You can still see it today. It's a museum. That house, as far as I know, is not haunted, but I digress. So being in this position of wealth and somewhat legal authority in town, he becomes active in local politics. And through this, he makes those important social connections, which makes him even more prominent. For example, he becomes a trustee of Washington College, now known as Washington and Jefferson College. His brother-in-laws get him onto the building committee, and he was instrumental in building McMillan Hall at Washington College, which still stands to this day. It's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. So he's a rising star in this community. However, something changes. So in 1791, our new federal government under our current constitution is struggling to pay lingering war debt from the Revolutionary War. And there's this kind of bickering back and forth. Some people are saying, I think each individual state should take care of their own war debt. Other people are like, no, the federal government should handle that war debt. But what it comes down to it is the fact that the country is just broke. So Congress, along with the executive branch in their infinite wisdom, decide, well, then we need to place a tax on something. And they're trying to figure out what to tax, and they come up with the idea, well, let's tax distilled spirits, whiskey. Now, in theory, that does sound like a good idea. You're a government, you need to raise money to pay off some debt, so you institute a tax. However, this is America. We had just fought a long, drawn-out war in which one of the major points of contention was excessive taxes. So the immediate reaction to this amongst the American citizens was, fuck your tax. And all of this kicks off an event in 1794 called the Whiskey Rebellion. And Bradford was actually a prominent figure in this rebellion. It was literally an insurrection. I mean, this guy was organizing protests, and there was going to be an armed uprising. Now, this rebellion was put down by President Washington himself. He had marched 13,000 troops to Washington, Pennsylvania, and they began arresting suspected rebels, and one of the warrants was for Bradford. They put a $500 bounty on his head. However, Bradford, hearing about this, he escapes. The rebellion is quashed, and he gets the hell out of town. He was actually warned of an approach of a nearby cavalry unit who was coming to arrest him, he actually leaps out his back window of his house and he makes a break for it. He leaps upon this horse he has, who was this beautiful gray mare, and if you know anything about gray horses, they're fast runners. I come from a family that's really big into horse racing, and they have always said that those grays can run. So he makes it to this place called McKee's Rocks, where he actually trades in his beautiful gray horse for a skiff. Now, a skiff is basically like a flatboat or a raft. He gets on the Ohio River and he takes it all the way to Portsmouth, which is in southern Ohio. So while he's running away, he meets the skipper of a keelboat who was also fleeing for his part in the rebellion. And this whole time, these soldiers are pursuing them to arrest them. And just as they were about to depart for New Orleans that next morning, the boat is boarded by these soldiers. However, the people manning the keelboat, they actually overpower these soldiers and throw them into the water. So now their muskets are useless. So these soldiers are kind of sloshing back to shore as the boat sails down the Ohio to the Mississippi and to freedom and exile, because at the time where he was going, Louisiana was not part of the United States. And in fact, Louisiana, it wasn't even the shape it was today. We know it today as that boot shape. However, it was actually split between the French and the Spanish. And in St. Francisville, where Bradford ends up and the rest of our story takes place, it was actually the Spanish colony of West Florida up until the 1820s. So Bradford does spend the rest of his life essentially in exile outside of the United States. So Bradford arrives and he starts to establish himself in St. Francisville. And in 1896, he purchases 650 acres, which he plans on turning into a plantation. He essentially buys it for like $1.50 an acre, which comes out to like $830 roughly, which at the time was somewhere around $20,000. So he got this property for a steal. So he calls this new plantation Laurel Grove, and he immediately puts his slaves, because this is the South in the 1790s and this guy was a rich slaveholder, and they build his little cottage or whatever that he's going to live in while they're leveling the ground to build the main house. And while they're leveling out the ground, they come across these skeletal remains. These remains turned out to be the remains of a local indigenous tribe called the Tanika people, and this was one of their burial grounds. Now, the Tanikan people, they were kind of a smaller Mississippian tribe. They had been in this area for hundreds of years. They actually were one of the tribes who encountered Hernando de Soto when he led one of his expeditions through the area. However, by the 1790s, they had kind of moved further west, so they weren't really in this area anymore. So, normal practice when you're leveling an area and you find an Indian burial ground, you kind of just stop and you're like, okay, maybe we should build somewhere else. But this is the 1790s and old Bradford had just bought this property and he was like, screw it. So it said that when the bodies were exhumed, he kind of just looted them for any grave goods and then burned the bodies, and he plopped the foundations of his new house right on top of this Indian burial ground. And this new house would be the first iteration of what we would now know as the iconic Myrtles Plantation. It was built in this classic Creole cottage style, which was popular back then in this area, and it was considered a beautiful house because old Bradford, he had good taste. Now Bradford, he lives alone on this property with just his slaves until 1799, when he finally sends for his family to come join him. It was around this time he was actually pardoned by John Adams for his role in the Whiskey Rebellion. However, he only returns to the United States once. He returns to sell his old house in Washington County in 1801, spends the rest of his life living at the Myrtles Plantation, or Laurel Grove as it is known in this time. So his wife and kids, they come down and live with him, and he lives there until 1808 when he dies. After his death, his wife Elizabeth continues running the plantation up until 1817, when she hands over management of the plantation to a man named Clark Woodruff. Now, Clark Woodruff, he was actually one of Bradford's former law students, and he had actually married one of the daughters, a girl named Sarah Matilda, and they would go on to be the primary residents of this plantation, and they had 3 children, Cornelia Gale, James, and Mary Octavia. Now, Clark Woodruff, he would turn out to be a very, very terrible person. So he was a judge in the local community. He was generally known as the judge, and he was known to be a staunch upholder of the law. However, his home life was very brutal and fraught with scandal, because Judge Woodruff was known to serially assault his female slaves, particularly this one Creole slave he owned named Chloe. Now, Chloe was this Creole woman of kind of what we would say mixed blood, and she was probably about 13 or 14 when Judge Woodruff took an interest in her, and she quickly became his favorite. With her becoming his favorite, he makes her a house slave so he can always have access to her. She's actually the governess over the children. And I want to quickly pause here because there's a power dynamic going on here. There's actually several power dynamics going on here, and a lot of it gets misconstrued in the storytelling of this legend, and some things need clarified. So for one, there is the obvious power dynamic between the slave and the master. A lot of retellings of this story for some reason say that they were having an affair, that they loved each other, that Chloe wanted to get into his good graces. That is complete BS, because any kind of situation where a human owns another human, nothing is consensual. The victim is simply ordered to do as they are told or endure punishment. However, there is a second power dynamic taking place here, and it has to do with slave hierarchy. And plantations did have a hierarchy when it came to slaves, because even when you're trapped in the absolute worst situation, you want to try to rise to the top if you can. So essentially, your field slaves, they were kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy. They were essentially treated and looked at as no better than cattle. Above that would be like your carpenters, your skilled slaves, your blacksmiths. They have a certain skill set that makes them a little more valuable. And then you have your house slaves, your domestic servants, your cooks, your maids, your butlers. Maybe if you're wealthy enough, you have slaves who can read and write, and they can act as secretaries or managers, for lack of a better term. And naturally, more beautiful, slender, light-skinned women, they would be chosen to be in the house. Men that maybe showed leadership qualities or organizational skills or something like that, they would become house slaves. They were essentially at the top of the hierarchy, and they wanted to stay at the top of that hierarchy, even if they have to endure something very grueling or horrific, like in the case of Chloe. Of course, one of the benefits at staying at the top of this hierarchy was the ability to control information. So the slaves who were in the household, they became to understand their master's routines, when they were coming and going, who they were meeting with, if they were planning to sell off somebody or a whole lot, which slaves they held that were probably in the good graces of the masters, and which ones were probably on the outs. And getting back to the story, Chloe was essentially at the top of this hierarchy, and she had the control of a lot of this information, which she could relay back to her people. However, her fellow slaves, especially her field slaves, warned her to be careful, don't get caught eavesdropping. However, she couldn't help herself. She would constantly eavesdrop on the conversations of the judge. And at one point, while the judge was in a meeting, I think it was in his bedroom or an office or something in the house, he opens up the door and he sees Chloe there with her left ear pressed up beside it, obviously eavesdropping on the conversation. And this enrages the judge. He immediately grabs her, drags her out to a shed, and cuts off her left ear. Like, not only was this guy a dick, he was a total barbarian. And I imagine the whole time while he's doling out this punishment, he's probably threatening her. He's probably threatening to send her back to the fields or to sell her even further down south, or maybe he's threatening to sell her off to somebody who's even more vicious than he is. You know, all that bullshit you say when you're angry. And of course, naturally, Chloe at this time, she's probably freaking out. She's probably thinking to herself, I have to do something to get back into the good graces of the judge, or I'm going to be sent out to the field or sold or worse. And on top of this, after the fact, the judge essentially tells her that he doesn't want to see her with her deformed ear walking around his property or his house or whatever. So he instructs her to wear this green turban at all times in order to hide the sight of this horrific cut off ear. And it's like, dude, if you didn't want to see it, you shouldn't have fucking did it in the first place, but I digress. So things kind of calm down and time moves on, and the judge, he takes a trip, I think to like New Orleans or something for business. But Chloe's still thinking in the back of her mind that she needs to do something to get back into the good graces of the judge, because she's still fearing that she's going to be sent out to the fields for this screw up. So she comes up with the plan that she's going to get the family sick, like really sick. She's essentially going to poison them with what is essentially essence of oleander. Oleander is a plant that's kind of native to the South. It's a decorative plant, And if you boil the leaves, you can create an extract that kind of acts like arsenic on the human body. She thinks in her mind, if I do it just right, if I poison them just enough to get them sick so I can then nurse them back to health, I'll be back in the good graces of not only the judge, but of the whole family, and I won't have to fear being shipped off to the fields or shipped off to another plantation. And this opportunity arises on the birthday of one of the daughters. Chloe's instructed by Mrs. Woodruff to essentially make a cake and throw a birthday party for the daughters. And Chloe, following orders, she bakes this really delicious, decadent chocolate cake. And before everybody goes crazy in the comment section, yes, they did have chocolate at this time and they did have cake at this time. Hell, George Washington's favorite thing to consume every morning was a cup of boiling chocolate. So yeah, they had chocolate cake at this time. However, in the mixture of this chocolate cake was her deadly surprise essence of oleander. However, she didn't really know anything about things like dosages, so she essentially just puts way too much in it, and shortly after eating this cake, the mother and the two daughters are dead. Eventually, word gets to Judge Woodruff. He comes back from New Orleans or Baton Rouge or wherever the hell he was, and he begins to kind of investigate what's going on. But he also notices that Chloe is just gone. She's disappeared. So essentially, his wife and his two daughters are dead, and his favorite slave is missing. And that leads us to the fate of Chloe in those intervening days before word got to the judge and he came back. So the night they ate the tainted cake, in the coming hours, one by one, they started writhing in agony, clutching at their abdomen, and Chloe had helped them to bed. And it said that she was trying desperately to reverse this poisoning process, but she didn't know how. It was too far gone. And that night, the mother and the two children had died. So word around the plantation starts to spread like wildfire because, you know how gossip is. And the slaves instantly know that Chloe did this. She's responsible for this. Be it from either gossip, be it from the fact that maybe she let her plan slip to someone. They found out very quickly. And instantly that power dynamic came back, that slave-master power dynamic. So basically, they got together and they said, we're not going to face any repercussions for the crime of one woman. We're going to prove our loyalty to the judge and we're going to deal with this problem before he even has to deal with it. So about a night or two later, after Chloe had fallen asleep, a couple of slaves came into her quarters, grabbed her, and dragged her out to an oak tree. And around that tree, all the slaves of the plantation were standing there with torches or whatever. And hanging from one of the lower branches of that tree was a freshly wound noose, and they hanged her right there. She died of slow strangulation. After she was dead, they cut her down and they threw her body into the swamp, knowing that the gators would devour her. After this incident and everything was kind of out in the open, the judge simply sealed off that dining room and never used it again. And Chloe's spirit is still there, trapped there on that property. It's said that she's normally seen around the area of the swamp where she died, but I'll get more into that later. This whole incident apparently took place in 1823-1824. Now, Judge Woodruff, he would continue living on this plantation until 1831. That's when the original owner's wife, Elizabeth Bradford, had died. So he leaves Laurel Grove in the hands of a caretaker until he finally sells it in 1834. He sells the plantation, the house, the slaves, everything to a man named Ruffin Gray Sterling and his wife, a woman named Mary Catherine Cobb. And they renovate the property and they actually add on to it. They more than double it in size. They bring it up to, I think, the 22 rooms that it is today. And they fill the house with imported furniture from Europe to, show off their wealth. And it's around this time in 1834 when it's formally changed from Laurel Grove to the Myrtles. And that name actually comes from an imported plant. I think it's like this pink flower or something called the crepe myrtle that grew in the vicinity. So they get this house, and befitting of young Southern aristocratic plantation owners, they expand it, they remodel it, they make it a true reflection of their wealth. However, tragedy does befall this family because out of the 9 children they have, only 4 of them really make it to marrying age or adulthood. And actually in 1854, both William Sterling and his older son Lewis would both die from consumption, also known as tuberculosis. However, despite these tragedies, that didn't stop the business acumen of his widow Mary Cobb. This woman not only went on to run the plantation for several years, but she also invested heavily in sugar plantations across the South. However, all this would eventually end in tragedy during the Civil War, because during the Civil War, the Myrtles would be looted by Union soldiers, and it was actually 3 Union soldiers who looted this house and were actually killed while looting this house. So essentially what happened was during the Civil War, there were 3 Union soldiers in the area, and they attempted to loot the Myrtles Plantation. So they were going to essentially just go in, ravage it, steal all their money and their cool shit, and, make off with war trophies. However, it would end tragically for them, because as they entered the house, boom, one by one, they were blown away by either the homeowners or nearby Confederate soldiers, we're not really sure. And they were kind of killed in that downstairs hall, kind of that central area of the house. And it said that in coming years, several maids would find these what looked like blood stains on the floor. And all attempts to clean up these blood stains has always been in vain. They just remain, and even when they're scrubbed away completely, they come back. And it's even said that ghostly apparitions of 3 Union soldiers can be found piled in kind of the middle of that kind of entrance hall area. And if you're not careful, you might just trip over one of them. Which actually brings us to another murder that took place in the Myrtles Plantation. And I believe it was one of Sterling's sons. It said that he was in kind of the game room at the time, which is now the dining room. He was essentially playing a card game and got into some gambling debt, and then they got into a fight and he was stabbed right there. And in the entrance to what is now the dining room where that man died and bled out, people have notoriously tripped over something that just isn't there. It's actually gotten so bad that the current owners who run the bed and breakfast for liability purposes alone go out of their way to keep that area as clear as possible, just so any guests don't trip and fall and crack their skull open or something. But overall, the Civil War would not be very kind to Mary Cobb and the Myrtles Plantation, because they had invested everything in the Confederacy. And when the Confederacy collapsed, their currency was worthless, the plantation system had been dismantled, and Mary Cobb nearly lost everything. And as a result of this, on December 5th, 1865, Mary Cobb hired William Drew Winter, who was the husband of her daughter Sarah Mumford, to act as her agent and attorney and to help manage what was left of the plantation lands. And in exchange for this, she gave Sarah and William the Myrtles, which became their new home. Now the Winters, they move into this home at the end of 1865, and they begin to manage the property. They also brought along their 6 children. However, not long after they moved into the plantation, tragedy would strike again, because they had this 3-year-old daughter named Kate. And Kate had come down with typhoid fever. So out of desperation, with nothing else working, they bring in this voodoo priestess to perform some kind of healing ritual. However, that fails as well, and young Kate unfortunately dies. For it's partly believed that due to the rituals that this voodoo priestess had performed, it's thought that the spirit or soul of young Kate still haunts the Myrtles in the room where she died to this day. And in her afterlife, she has learned some of these voodoo rituals, and some guests say that they wake up at night in this room to a young girl practicing voodoo rituals and spells on these people while they sleep. Now, 1867 would continue to be a tragic year for the Winters. They were just unable to make the plantation produce any wealth in this post-Civil War world. And by December 1867, being completely bankrupt, they were forced to sell the Myrtles to the New York Warehouse and Security Company. However, only 2 years later, there is kind of a reversal in fortune where Sarah Winter was able to actually purchase the Myrtles back. Now, no one really knows what caused this reversal in fortune. However, the Myrtles and the plantation is back in the hands of the Winters. But shortly after, tragedy would strike again, and this tragedy was in the murder of William Winters. So in 1871, Winters was actually in the gentleman's parlor, and it was said that he was teaching a Sunday school class, when all of a sudden he heard someone approach the house on horseback, and this stranger called out to him saying that he had some business with him. So he goes out to the side gallery of the house, and bam, he's shot. And it's like a gut shot, so it's not good. And the rider, he just takes off. And to this day, we don't quite quite know who he was or why he killed William Winter, but the newspaper at the time had reported that a man named E.S. Weber was to stand trial for Winter's murder. However, no outcome of the case is ever recorded, so we really don't know who the killer of Winter was. Now, Winter, he's gut shot, and anybody who's been gut shot will know that it is completely agonizing, and you know you're gonna die. He slowly limps back into the house, and he's crawling up the stairs because his wife, Sarah, she's up on the second floor, and she meets him on the stairs, and all she can do is just kind of comfort him and hold him while he dies in her arms. And it's said to this day that that tragedy left a kind of scar on the Myrtles, and to this day, people approaching the stairs can hear the wailing of a young woman as she's crying for her dead husband. Now, Sarah, she was devastated by this incident, and it said that she never remarried. She actually lives the rest of her life at the Myrtles alongside her mother, Mary Cobb, and her brothers, and she would die in April 1878 at the age of 44. And her mother, Mary Cobb Sterling, would actually outlive her. She lived until 1880, after which the Myrtles is purchased by one of her sons, Stephen Sterling. Now, Stephen, he was thought to have been a drunk and a gambler who had squandered the family fortune. However, in reality, it just seems like the Myrtles was just too in debt for him to dig them out of it. And then after this, the house goes on to fall into a series of other owners up until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, this is when the ghost stories about the Myrtles start to come out. And these stories really start with this woman named Marjorie Munson, who was this wealthy widow. I think she owned like chicken farms or something. And she had heard some of the local stories and local folklore going around about hauntings at the Myrtles Plantation. And this is where the story of Chloe comes from. She said that some of the older women in the community were telling a tale of a woman in a green turban who was possibly a Creole slave girl who had an affair with her master, haunted the plantation, and could be seen in areas around like the swamp. And actually in the original tale, she was a ghost of a woman in a green beret who haunted the Myrtles. And Marjorie actually penned a song about it, and this gets into the local folklore and becomes the story of Chloe. And by the 1970s, that story was essentially the story that we hear today. In November 1980, the story of Chloe actually appears in Life magazine, and then it gets all the ghost hunting enthusiasts and historians excited, so they dig into the history of the plantation, and it quickly becomes known as one of the most haunted houses in America. And that really brings us to the modern day hauntings of the Myrtles. Now, we already know the story of Chloe, and her ghost is usually seen around the swamp area where she was killed. However, in 1992, the owners of the Myrtles Plantation were taking photos of the house so they could send to their insurance company for like liability reasons, and that's where the infamous Chloe photo first appears. And this photo shows an image of a woman in what looks like a turban, just kind of standing there next to the house, kind of looking off into the distance. And this photograph has actually been scrutinized and determined to not be a fake. That image, there's actually a woman in that image wearing a green turban. Or I guess I can just say a turban. It's a black and white photo, so you don't know if it's actually green or not. And the owners allege to this day that when they took that photo, that no one was standing there. And why would anybody be? It's a photo taken for like insurance purposes. There have also been sightings of children, the young girls that were killed by Chloe, kind of playing in the rain. And guests would be baffled when their children would tell them that they were just outside playing with some other children. However, they would inquire about it and realize that no other guests in the place had any children. And speaking of the children, one of the young girls who actually resembles a portrait that's in one of the dining rooms, I think, or parlors, or I don't know. Her apparition is said to be playing around the house. Some people say that they see her like jumping on their bed when they enter their room, or they can see her like kind of peeking out the windows when they approach the main house. We do know that some children did tragically pass away at the Myrtles, so it would make sense that their spirits would be there. It is also said that children and handprints would appear in these mirrors in the Myrtle's house kind of right outside the dining room area. And even after these mirrors had been cleaned and restored and even resilvered, handprints left behind of the ghostly children would still appear on these mirrors. And of course we have the infamous bloodstains of the Union soldiers and the death of William Sterling, who died on the 17th step. And that incident still kind of plays out on a loop with his wife wailing over this tragedy. And there are just countless stories from guests that allege that they have had encounters with ghosts at the Myrtles. Now, it seems like a place like the Myrtles where tragedy has kind of been the running theme of its 200 plus year existence would be a hotbed for paranormal activity, especially when it's exacerbated by an ancient Indian burial ground. And given the tragedies that are there, a lot of these entities probably have unfinished business and they are unable to really move on into that next realm or dimension or wherever ghosts and spirits go. And there's kind of a funny thing about death, especially if it's a tragic or dramatic death or a sudden death. If the spirit or soul or whatever has unfinished business, is unable to move on, they'll linger in that spot where they died, because there's this general belief that those spots where they died are like portals, so it's where they last experienced life. And that spot becomes attracted to them in the afterlife. They'll actually return to it, and that's where they'll kind of like draw energy. That's where you get things like cold spots and haunted houses and stuff. But at the end of the day, we really have to ask ourselves, how much of this is true and how much of this is just myth? And unfortunately, when it comes to the case of the Myrtles, a vast majority of it is myth, and we're going to dive into that in this segment. So when we dive into the real history of the Myrtles, we find a lot of embellishments, half-truths, and local legends. And these embellishments go back to even before the Myrtles was created. So let's start with David Bradford, the man who originally built the house and bought the property. Now, it was true he was a prominent lawyer, like a district attorney, and a prominent player in the Whiskey Rebellion. However, he wasn't really forced to flee. Now, while there was a bounty on his head, the federal government wasn't really interested in capturing him. He was actually kind of advised to leave town by other members of this rebellion, whom for their own reasons didn't really want him involved any further. Plus, the government already having a tense situation on their hands didn't want to exacerbate things by like arresting or executing a prominent, popular local district attorney. So he kind of just took his family and left town and went to Pittsburgh. And he gets onto this coal barge and he kind of takes it over to Portsmouth and then down to Spanish Florida. And while there were some soldiers who knew of his presence on this barge, they didn't really go out of their way to like really try to capture him or anything. He essentially just goes down to Spanish West Florida. He purchases this land and he starts building his plantation. And later, as everything settles, President Adams, he pardons him and he's able to retrieve his family, and he spends the rest of his life at the Myrtles. And the president didn't actually just pardon him out of like the goodness of his heart or anything. Bradford, in exile in Spanish Florida at the Myrtles, actually petitioned for a pardon and was granted it, citing reasons such as he was been separated from his family, he's been living in exile, he's truly sorry for his actions, blah blah blah. So that brings us to this chapter in his life where he's building the plantation. Now, there is no evidence whatsoever that the plantation was built on ancient Tanican Indian burial grounds. While the Tanika people did live in this region for hundreds of years, we don't see any archaeological evidence in or around the Myrtles plantation of it being a Native American burial ground. So the story of these slaves digging up these bodies and burning them or whatever is a complete modern fabrication, and to be honest, I can't find any evidence to suggest that this is anything more than an internet rumor that got started sometime in the 2000s. But houses being built on ancient burial ground and then there being some curse, that's kind of an old trope in ghost storytelling. It seems like every haunted house is built on ancient Native American burial ground, and by disturbing these remains, you are now cursed. And I really think that this story kind of has a link to the Bell Witch story, which I discussed in my season 3 premiere, so go check that one out. Now, that story comes from the early 19th century. It's the story of the Bell family, and they actually did build their plantation on a Native American burial ground. It's said that when they leveled a burial mound, that it angered the spirit and it kicked off that haunting. And I think these accounts that started in the 50s of the hauntings of the Myrtles Plantation possibly has some kind of link in local folklore that derived from the haunting of the Bell Witch. Naturally, that house was built on an ancient Indian burial ground, so this house too must be built on some kind of ancient Indian burial ground. And that just hits the popular culture and just becomes a trope in horror stories today. Hell, the entire Poltergeist film series is based upon the fact that they built their house over a graveyard and the spirits were essentially pissed off. But yeah, the whole Native American burial ground thing, it's a myth at best. So next we get into the story about Clark Woodruff and Chloe. And to put it blunt, it is a complete fabrication. It was created sometime after the 1950s. Clark Woodruff was actually a very upstanding citizen in this area at this time. At a very young age, Clark Woodruff makes his way down to Louisiana and he meets with Woodruff and he begins his studies to be a lawyer. During this time, he meets Sarah Matilda and they become married, and they're actually married on November 19th, 1817. And after the death of his now father-in-law, he goes on to manage Laurel Grove. He expands the holdings and he plants about 650 acres of indigo and cotton. And together they go on to have 3 children, Cornelia Gale, James, and Mary Octavia. However, when you look into the historic records, there was never a slave named Chloe or Chloe or any variant of that name owned by the Woodruffs. Chloe simply didn't exist, and there's no evidence that Woodruff was having an affair with any of his slaves or forcing himself upon any of his slaves. Now, it's documented in the historic record that Sarah Matilda actually died on July 21st, 1823 after contracting yellow fever, and it was said that this completely crushed him. He was completely heartbroken after his wife died. And then in 1824, another wave of yellow fever would come through, and on July 15th, 1824, his son James died of the disease. And then only 2 months later, sometime in September, his oldest daughter, Cornelia Gale, dies of the same disease during this epidemic. And Octavia, his youngest daughter, goes on to live a long life. He actually lives with her up until the end of his life, where he dies on November 25th, 1851. And as I mentioned earlier, the story of Chloe doesn't really show up until post-1950. To be honest, it kind of emerges during that period in the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s of the civil rights movement, and it's kind of just a constant reminder of the brutal way in which slaves were treated. Now, I'm not trying to be an apologist or anything for Woodruff. He was a slave owner and a terrible person by modern standards. We really don't know how he treated his slaves, but I think when that story becomes attached to him, he's seen as nothing more than a monster. Personally, I think that's a little unfair to just completely fabricate a story to turn a guy into a monster just because he lived in a world and participated in a trade which was completely barbaric by our modern standards. But that's why separating the myth from the reality is so important, because it gives us the real history. You can't build a modern society just completely based on myth, and you can't demonize people just because you don't like the way that they acted during their lives. Of course, after all this, the Myrtles does fall into the hands of the Sterlings, and they're the ones who give it the name the Myrtles, and tragically, several of their children would die at the Myrtles. Out of 9 children, only 4 of them made it to adulthood, and while it was true that the plantation was ransacked and looted during the Civil War, there's no documentation of 3 Union soldiers being murdered in the Myrtles by the people defending it. There's also no evidence that anybody was ever stabbed over a gambling debt in the game room, which is now the modern day dining room, and died right there on the kind of entrance to said room. However, it is true that William Winter was murdered on the porch of the Myrtles in January of 1871 by an unknown man. However, that story of him dragging himself back into the house and dying on the 17th step of the stairway while cradled in his wife's arms while she wailed. That's a complete fabrication. That dude dropped dead right there on the porch after he was shot. And that murder is really the only verifiable murder at the Myrtles in history. So that bears the question, is the Myrtles really haunted? Well, it's hard to answer. And it's a big reason why I don't really do a whole lot of ghost stories on this show, because they are just too hard to verify or debunk. There's literally nothing to say that the Myrtles is not haunted. Remember, this plantation has an over 200-year history of people dying, young children dying of mostly tuberculosis, yellow fever, stuff like that. One verifiable murder, and the scars just left behind from the dark memories of the days of slavery. A lot of tragedy and sadness happened in this place, so it's hard for it to not be haunted. And we also have to look at the accounts of current guests of the Myrtles. There are constant, endless accounts of people saying that they've seen children playing around. They've seen a Creole woman in a turban wandering around the plantation. Guests have actually tripped over essentially nothing on their way into the dining room. And the wails of a distraught woman have been heard on the staircase. Now, there's kind of a phenomena which goes on in kind of ghost lore that states that in a place where there's been tragedy, that tragedy can be essentially recorded onto the landscape or onto the house or whatever, and it essentially can play back in a loop. And the children whose lives are tragically cut short of disease, they might not know how to move on, and they spend their eternity playing in the only place where they've ever known. But at the end of the day, it can all just be a fabrication. It can be a fabrication of our minds, because we hear the stories of the Myrtles in entertainment and even on this podcast, and you're primed for that. So when you go there, you're looking for those ghosts, and you might see something and your mind might play a trick on you. And plus, this narrative, these ghost stories, are all obviously pushed by the workers and the people who own the Myrtles Plantation today in order to draw in more guests. That's just good old-fashioned American capitalism at its finest. Who wants to stay at some boring old plantation house down the road when you can stay at the most haunted house in America? Hell, the whole story makes me want to go down there for a visit or a night or two. And hell, when these stories got into the hands of the modern media, they were gonna be highly embellished. That's just good entertainment. And it provided a wealth of entertainment for me when I was researching all this stuff in an attempt to try to separate the facts from the legend, because if you type the Myrtles Plantation into Google, you just hear like the same 3 or 4 ghost stories over and over again. It's kind of hard to actually decipher the history of this place unless you know where to look. But fortunately for myself, and I don't mean to brag, but I am very tenacious when I dive into these subjects. I want to find the true history behind the legend, behind the myth, and I won't stop until I actually find it. But that's all I really have to say about the Myrtles Plantation. Personally, I think it's haunted. Now, obviously, the history of the plantation is overshadowed by these fantastic stories which came out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even come out to this day. But that's all kind of the fun of the whole thing. We want to hear those stories because the truth of the matter is the actual history is a little bit boring when you dive into it. Nobody wants to hear these children died of yellow fever and now haunt the mansion. No, they want to hear some tale of murder and revenge and tragedy and love. It just simply makes for a better story. And on that note, I am going to wrap things up. So once again, this is Mike. This is Urban Legends and Mythology. And if you like what I'm doing and want to see me continue doing it, all I ask is for a little bit of support. Like it on Spotify or whatever platform you're listening to this on. This podcast is literally on every podcast platform I can think of. It's even on YouTube. Follow it on the social medias if you want. That's the best place to contact me. I recently started posting a lot of stuff on Threads, which I think is like an Instagram knockoff of what Twitter used to be, but it has a nice little following over there, so I'm going to keep doing it. Spam links to my shows, send them to your friends, send them to your enemies. And as always, if you want to help out the show monetarily, it's greatly appreciated. It's literally what keeps this show going. You can support me by clicking that link in the description of every episode. It's just support this podcast, and there's 3 little tiers, and you can just pick one, and that really helps out a lot. Or if you don't like doing that, reach out to me personally. I will give you like my Cash App or something. I don't know. My crypto wallet. Send me that old Bitcoin that you're not using anymore because you've forgotten about it. And if you don't want to do all of that, just listen and enjoy. Maybe tell a friend. Once again, I do thank you for listening listening, and I will see you in the next episode.